Well, hello everyone, and thank you for attending this book launch for my colleague, Professor Alice Bradbury's recently published book, Ability, Inequality and Post-Pandemic Schools, Rethinking Contemporary Myths of Meritocracy, published by Policy Press. I'm Dominic Wise, and I'm director of the Helen Hamlyn Centre for Pedagogy, and I'm chairing today's event. As well as being a co-director of the Helen Hamlyn Centre for Pedagogy, Alice is Professor of Sociology of Education in the Department of Education, Practice and Society at the UCL Institute of Education. Alice's research focuses on the impact of education policy on primary and early years education, exploring the impact of datification and issues of social justice. Drawing on a research project dealing with ability grouping practices, Alice's book analyses how the recent educational developments of datafication and neuroscience have revised ideas about how we classify and label children. The book also explores how we can rethink the idea of innate intelligence as we rebuild a post-pandemic schooling system. This book presents a keen opportunity to rethink the education system's assumption of ability to be measurable innate and how this myth of meritocracy reinforces educational inequalities. I'm also really pleased today to welcome Professor Carol Vincent, who is Professor of the Sociology of Education at the UCL Institute of Education, and who will provide a response to the book following Alice's presentation. Thanks, Carol, for joining us today. Just before I hand over to Alice, I'll just do a little bit of housekeeping. We will be taking questions throughout the event through the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of your screen. So please do keep the questions coming in throughout, and we'll do our best to answer them in a Q&A session at the end of the event. We're also thrilled to say that Policy Press have provided us with a discount code for the book, which will give you 30% off when you buy Ability, Inequality and Post-Pandemic Schools from the Policy Press website. My colleague Will Ansell will put the code in the chat for all those who are interested, and it will also be emailed to you following the event. Without further ado, Alice, over to you.
Thank you, Dom. And while I just share my screen, I will start by saying thank you very much to my colleagues in HHCP for organising today and helping to deal with all the technical issues. Hopefully you can now see my screen. Well, first of all, everyone else, thank you for coming. It would be lovely to be having an in-person book launch. It would be great to be sitting in the Institute having a, you can just imagine yourselves, you know, just having a nice cup of tea and some of those little biscuits in packets, or maybe even if you want to be extravagant, having an Institute glass of wine. But I'm afraid it has to all be imagined as we all sit and do this all online. I'm very glad, though, anyway, people have come today to hear me talk about the book. We've postponed this a couple of times, so it's great to see that people are prepared to bear with us and come today. Obviously, I'm going to talk about the book. Dom has done a nice little summary. I'm wondering whether I need to even go into all of the rest of it, but we're here for a bit of time, so I probably should. I put both the kind of logos here of our the two research centres. I'm co-director of HHCP, but also I wanted to put on the Centre for Sociology of Education and Equity because it was my colleagues in that centre that I worked with on lots of our master's degrees who all took on extra work and allowed me to have a term of sabbatical in order to sort of start writing this book. So I'm very grateful to them for their help. I thought I'd start by just explaining where this book came from in the first place, because it's a bit different to quite a lot of other kind of research kind of based books. I had some data from a project I did with Guy Roberts-Holmes on ability grouping. In that, we did a big survey of teachers about their grouping practices. And one of the questions we asked within that survey was, what do you understand by the term ability? And so we ended up with this really interesting data with over 1,000 responses from teachers about what the term ability is. There was a small conference organised by Eleanor Hargreaves about the idea about ability. And I put a presentation together for that on kind of looking at this data, these 1,000 responses. And it started to kind of really interest me and make me think, well, you know, there's real potential here for a kind of bigger discussion about this idea of ability. That said, I realized recently that my MA thesis was actually called Ability and Inequality. So perhaps I've just been banging on about the same thing for a very long time. But this kind of data set sort of really made me start to think, well, actually, maybe I should go back and think more about this point about ability, particularly because I had the feeling that discourses of ability were kind of being reinvigorated in school settings, certainly from the project we did about grouping, but also in kind of other work as well. So the other thing that kind of brought me to this was the work I'd done with Ian Magimsi and Diego Santori about the way that new knowledges were being transferred into education policy. And we talked in that about neuroscience and the way in which neuroscience was being kind of used in kind of reshaping the subject of policy. So I kind of drew on some of that work as well to think about how things are changing in education and what kind of influences, what kind of new things are kind of developing and arriving that reshape how education works. Of course, in the middle of all of this, COVID comes along and actually then invigorates again a lot of issues to do with inequality, changes, you know, many of the kind of ideas about what matters in education. And I thought this was a really good kind of way of saying, actually, this is a time when we can rethink myths of meritocracy. We can rethink how we think about ability in schools and try and hope in this post-pandemic era that that things can be different. When I finished the manuscript in sort of July 2020, I thought by now we would be post-pandemic. It doesn't feel very post at the moment, but my hope was that we would be further on than we are. So probably even since I did the manuscript, I think some of the information has been, you know, could be updated. So that's where it all comes from. Excuse me. So what I thought I would start by, what is it about? Well, as you might expect, it's about ability and inequality. It's about ability as an idea, as a discourse. I put it in inverted commas at the start, and then I say, look, I can't do this anymore because it's too awkward, but it's an idea. It's a way of thinking about children. And as I say in the introduction to the book, it's actually quite difficult in some ways to write about ability because, you know, like many people I'm sure in this room, if not everyone in this room, I was always one of these people being labelled high ability when I was at school. It was part of kind of who I was, both as a child, perhaps also as an adult. And actually, it's quite difficult to kind of unpick some of those ideas, particularly when they're things that have always been a very positive experience. So, of course, one of the things I've really emphasised to me through the work of the Eleanor Hargreaves study of children in low attaining, who are labelled as low attaining, is quite how powerless those people who are labelled as low attaining or low ability are within the system. The other thing it's about is inequality, which has been a kind of long-standing interest of mine. Particularly, it's about race and about class. So it's also then about how teachers use ability, using this data I've got about teachers understanding ability, how they use it in the classroom and what kind of implications it has. But it's then also about these two developments, neuroscience and datification. And these two things, I argue, are reinvigorating the use of ability as an idea and having a real effect on our understanding of the term. In terms of theory, as one might expect, it's got a lot of Foucault in it. Well, not a lot of Foucault. I really tried to avoid going all Foucault on the reader, but there is definitely some for those of you who like that kind of thing. And I don't think you can really talk about some of these discourses operating as regimes of truth without using Foucault. So there's a lot of stuff about disciplinary power and biopower, which I'm not going to go into so much today. There's also CRT, which I use as a critical race theory, which I use as a kind of orientating perspective. I wouldn't say it's a CRT book. It's just that I'm kind of building on some of the ideas in CRT about particularly racism as endemic. So I'm not interested in kind of proving that the system is racist or proving that there is institutional racism within the system. I'm just sort of starting from the position that the system has very inequitable results, and we should be investigating how these happen, how they work, rather than attempting to sort of prove them in the first place. So that's the kind of theory that sits behind it. And then, of course, what I get to, one hopes, is these post-pandemic hopes, my kind of aims and hopes for the future. It's not, the book is about the idea of ability or intelligence and whether it exists. That is not my field or my world at all, of understanding whether people have some kind of fixed intelligence or and so on. Don't get involved in that debate. I'm just interested in how the idea is working. It's also not about gender, because the whole gender thing about male and female brains, about kind of sex differences in intelligence is another whole area. You could write a whole nother book about that. So it's not really about gender either. It's also not really about a research project. So unlike my previous books, it doesn't kind of set out a whole load of research findings. It's much more of a kind of argument book, though there is this data, which was the kind of trigger. So it's a slightly different sort of form. And as I said, it's not really about kind of proving issues to do with class and race. I'm taking it as understood that the education system has inequitable effects in terms of social reproduction of inequalities by race and also by class. So why do I think we should be talking about ability? Well, the first point is that it's a very taken for granted idea. So both as a teacher myself, I had my high ability and low ability groups, and I see that again and again in classes I go into. It's just a normal thing to talk about children as being high ability and low ability. I remember in doing ethnographic study in reception, and the new children were coming up from nursery, labelled already as HA or LA. It was just normal to be labelling 4-year-olds as something high or low ability. And also I see it obviously in my as a parent, my own children's experiences, that now they are being labelled as high ability, and that has particular effects for them within the classroom. It's also important because of the implications. So obviously all the huge amounts of work on grouping, my interest in learner identities and how teachers understand different groups of students. Ability is a very kind of central part of that. And as I said, there's this kind of, the trigger is this strange data set of responses from teachers on what ability is, which really reveals how kind of slippery the term is. So I'm really interested in the work that ability does as an idea within the system. So when I think about ability and inequality, and I'm certainly not the first person to be doing this. This is a long-standing interest, but one in which I'm basically saying we should be talking about this again because I'm arguing that it's been reinvigorated, remade in new and interesting and dangerous ways. They're always intertwined. There is a long history of association between IQ and race, for example, also to do with class and potential, which I delve into in the book. But they have always been intertwined. You can't have a history of one without the other. So it's very important to kind of keep up and kind of provide a contemporary analysis of what is going on. And as I've said, I'm arguing that ability has this incredibly important role in establishing and maintaining those patterns of inequality. because we begin to see different expectations as a Ladbrokes can first talk about it being a psychological issue rather than something socially unequal. Also, it works the idea of ability through all these kind of everyday practices, the kind of very normal everyday workings of schools. For example, Louise Archer's written a lot about, with her colleagues, about setting with older children, talking about that as a technology of social reproduction. So overall, I'm really saying that we have this kind of meritocracy, which is obviously a myth, but it's one that works really well to obscure inequalities. And ability as an idea is very obviously central. The idea of merit is very central to that meritocracy. Excuse me, and my sore throat. But why do it now? Well, there is some interesting kind of political background. Theresa May, if you remember her, said on the front steps of Downing Street, I want Britain to be the world's great meritocracy, a country where everyone has a fair chance to go as far as their talent and hard work will allow. There's a lot of discussion, still since Theresa May, and Boris Johnson has some pretty appalling quotes on intelligence, if you're interested, which I put in the book. There is still this idea and a discourse amongst politicians about people and their talents and their the idea of merit. It's still a sort of alive and well within politics, and it's also there within other politicians, including opposition politicians, talking about talent. So it's definitely, I think, still something to be pushed back against, this sort of myth of merit. There's also, of course, a huge impact of the pandemic. And this quote from Gavin Williamson, who was Education Secretary at the time, since been removed. He talks about how poor children will be the ones suffering most. And obviously, a lot of the research that's been coming out has been talking about the kind of hugely differential impact on different groups of children. But what I'm slightly concerned about is some of the discussion, for example, which we sort of hinted at in this Gavin Williamson quote, about home learning environments and kind of deterministic discourses of who is going to do well, who's got good background or not. So there is I think, in the pandemic, a danger that we start to make those kind of deterministic assumptions about homes and experiences at school. I put that quote in from the project I've done with Gemma Moss and several other colleagues about this kind of hope that the pandemic means we can begin again with a broader definition. So there's also this idea that the pandemic is a moment where we can rethink things. The other reasons why doing it now, which maybe not quite so familiar, are that there is an interesting kind of evolving literature and discussion about some of the impact of scientific developments, some people calling it a new eugenics, and that's all to do with the sequencing of the human genome, and Gilborn calls it a new genism. That's kind of very positive sort of story about how we can understand the human condition better, which actually, as Gilborn talks about it being it's always racist, rarely mentioned at all. There's also discussion, they call it the post-genomic era, also discussion about what epigenetic research does to this discussions about children and education. So epigenetic research is where you talk about how environments affect genes and kind of change what's going on. And Dorling and Tomlinson have kind of critiqued some of this discussion, and they talk about how the problem is that actually there is great potential to kind of understand this relationship better, but at the same time, a lot of the discussion about intelligence is actually, really is going in the opposite direction. It's not providing a more sophisticated account. And Maloney talks about how this kind of idea of soft inheritance that, you know, that is more epigenetic, that we might be about environment and genes, doesn't really provide a kind of nicer, rosier picture that has any more potential to disrupt inequalities. He says, you know, there's no reasons to believe that the soft inheritance claims will produce a less exclusionary discourse than the kind of hard heredity genetics discourse. So there is real kind of warning signs from kind of critical social scientists about some of the science and what it's being used for. So that also justifies why we should write about these things. So one of the things I do in the book is talk about educational inequalities. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I think it's kind of important to always keep saying to people that we do have a system which has consistent and persistent inequalities. I've got a couple of graphs. These are actually the latest figures because there haven't been assessments for the last couple of years. So I think it's just important to sort of flag up and say to people, there really are still, if we look at attainment data, which is obviously problematic, and if you look at anything else I've written, even if we look at what people are kind of being labelled as, what they're coming out with, there are real differences between free school meals and non-free school meal pupils, and there are big differences between different ethnic groups. That's at age 4 and 5, and then at also at 10 and 11. And I discuss these in a lot more detail in the book, and obviously some of the discussion, which is a huge field in itself, about why these happen. I also talk about exclusion figures, because I want to emphasize that I'm not talking about inequalities just in terms of attainment, but also in terms of experiences and so on. So we get these figures. So just these are I picked the 3 lowest groups and the 3 highest groups here. And just to kind of explain the figures, what this means is that, say, for every 10,000 Black Caribbean pupils, you get 1,046 exclusions. These are temporary exclusions, whereas you get 50 for the Chinese group, who are the lowest group. There's also a big difference in terms of free school meals and non-free school meals. So that's 1,365 per 10,000 pupils compared to 373 from the non-free school meal group. They're pretty much the same kind of pattern for permanent exclusion as well. And I think it's just, you know, as I said, it's important to remember that it's not just attainment, it's also inequality in terms of many other aspects of school life. There's also, of course, this issue of pandemic inequality, which is seen as kind of exacerbating, the COVID pandemic has exacerbated the inequalities we already have. We found in the Duty to Care project, which was going on as I was finishing the writing of this book, the feeling that disadvantaged communities were going to be more penalised, and particularly those teachers who were in disadvantaged areas felt that this was going to be more penalised. And as the evidence kind of comes out, the real impact of the kind of material effects of poverty is being shown again and again. So all the more reason to kind of still keep interrogating this problem. So what do the teachers say? Let's get to that point. If I look across the kind of 1,000 responses, the vast majority fall into these first 2 kind of categories, and I provide this kind of taxonomy of category of the responses, where I'm going to show you some examples in a minute, just to try and kind of see how is this idea working and what's going on with it. So the majority, as I said, talk about ability as something innate or as something positional, and then there's a kind of smaller group, but a good number, that talk about it as an attribute, which is a slightly more tricky thing. So obviously the idea of innate is they talk about as intelligence or a skill or as a talent, or sometimes as potential, basically something that, you know, the child has or doesn't have. The second one is positional, which is about where you are on a scale or on a measure or on a spectrum. It's about your level, or it's about where you are in relation above or below. And then you get this slightly stranger ones, which are about ability, something as a sort of attribute. It's about, particularly with younger children, about being ready to learn. It's about the knowledge that you've got, or sometimes it's about your background, which is a bit worrying. So I'll give you some examples here. These are actual quotes from the teachers. So there's a lot of kind of innate stuff is about you are able or you're not able. You have a talent or a skill or potential. The positional is about levels or scores or above or below age-related expectations. That's the government term. So you can see the difference between those. You get this sort of, it's something a child has, or where they are in relation to everyone else, or it's these different attributes, which are, as I said, readiness, knowledge, or sometimes it's about background. And what I kind of come to in this much longer discussion about how teachers understand ability is to kind of focus on these first two, really. I should say there are some other ones which I talk about, which try and kind of, they bring in various different things. It's not like every bit of data fits into these three boxes, but the vast majority fit with them. So basically, I come to this idea that these two discourses are very powerful, particularly the one of ability is innate, which is a kind of very biological and sometimes neurological way of thinking. Ability is something that the children have in their brains to varying degrees. And then you get the other one, which is ability is positional, which is about something, inability is something measurable. It's a place where they are, scores and positions that can, of course, be reflections of something more innate, but mainly the main thing is that they're positional. And that's obviously a sort of real simplification. It's a way of reducing complexity into boxes or numbers. And these two different things, ability is innate and ability is positional, I'm arguing are kind of reawoken by these two different developments of neuroscience and datification. So hopefully you can see the link with these two things. So, neuroscience. It was very fascinating finding out about neuroscience. The main issue that I kind of have with it, the reason why I think it becomes problematic, is its potential to rework these discourses of determinism. To provide a bit of background, there's a lot of discussion about neuroscience, the neuroturn, basically because it's a relatively new science. There's a lot of technological change, which means we can basically see brains a lot better than we ever could before. And that has allowed a lot of people to make a lot of claims about the brain. And it's very kind of new and exciting. And that's also leads to people over-claiming, as Nicholas Rose talks about. The problem is, because, of course, the layperson doesn't really understand neuroscience, it feel very vulnerable to misunderstanding. And it's also affected by this idea of epigenetics, the idea that the brain is initially patterned by our genes, but then there is an environmental input which changes how the brain works, which Pickersgill talks about as a new story about the brain in and society. In education, there's this caution about DeVos calls a neuro tsunami hailing everybody, and the kind of risk of overstating the effect that this information can have on what we actually do. And this is all kind of despite the fact there's for a long time been cautions like Usha Goswami's comment here about actually how unrealistic it is to think that neuroscience is actually going to help us with anything kind of on the everyday level at the moment. So I make two kind of key points about neuroscience and its influence on education. The first is that because everything neuro is sort of hyped up and seen as cutting edge, we get this, it's a new knowledge, as I wrote with Ian Jimsy and Diego Santori about a new knowledge being transferred into education. Because of that, the kind of competing claims, the ambiguities, the debates within neuroscience all get kind of glossed over because everyone wants to talk about these new insights, and actually the sort of subtleties and complexity get forgotten. And that means that when neuroscience is operationalized, it's translated into these kind of real life situations like classrooms, it's pretty much always problematic because of this simplification. And my worry is that these ideas, these new ideas get misapplied and reinscribe older notions that are familiar to us about hierarchy and deficit. So there is an extensive kind of writing about neuroscience. There is some research evidence, which I won't go into in too much detail, about, which I've listed here, about kind of how it's being used and misapplied in various different contexts, including this Edwards work of people hands on the wall and saying, you know, this is what makes a real difference. Reminds me to keep working with these children. It's particularly dangerous in early years because we get this kind of myth of the first 3 years. And there's a lot of kind of discussion about the way in which it kind of the oversimplification, the kind of impoverishment of a lot of neuroscience discourse. There's always a kind of inherent issue for me in some of the discussion about neuroscience and the way that it reinscribes kind of ideas about what is normal and what isn't. And I've put some quotes here which illustrate that, including in the green there, that's a quote from the grouping project where the teacher says, you know, if you had all the children come to school at the same point and everybody's brains were exactly the same, but it's not. So there's the brain, this kind of neuroscience ideas and the brain are very powerful in justifying why we treat children differently. There is this discourse of the irreparable brain, which I think is really worrying, which is about this myth of the first 3 years. The quotes here are from a Centre for Social Justice report, and that's David Cameron, talking about this idea that mums and dads build babies' brains, destinies can be altered for good or ill. And I find that all a bit worrying because, of course, what happens if your brain is damaged in the first 3 years? What does that mean for you in school? What does it mean about where you fit into society and so on? I think there's some really slightly worrying. And my concern is that what we're seeing is these Gilson and Baker talk about old threats in shiny new technologies, the way that we can return to a lot of very old and damaging ideas, but put in the guise of neuroscience. And so this is basically what I come to, that we get this dangerous discourse of labeling and determinism, the idea that children's brains are affected by their backgrounds. For reasons of time, I think I need to move on to the next one. So the other side, the ability is positional, is affected by datification. I wrote a whole book with Guy Roberts-Holmes about the datification of the education system. So here I just kind of update some of that discussion a bit, add a few more kind of more up-to-date things. There's a possibility, of course, that COVID is exacerbating it because of the move online. I'm concerned that shifting us even more into this idea of education legible as numbers. And it's a kind of, I'm basically saying datification is a very sort of specific rationality. I talk about it in the book in terms of the 5 Ps of datification. And what I'm trying to do there is emphasize that datification isn't just about how teachers change their pedagogy or their practice in relation to data. It's about how they change their priorities, like what they're spending their time on, what, you know, filling in spreadsheets and so on. But it's also about subjectivities, the people. It changes who the child is as data producer, it changes who the teacher is as data recorder. It has all these kind of other effects. And of course, it has this real kind of shift in power because of the practices of datification that are about accountability and control and so on. So I use that kind of schema just to summarize. So I am saying that actually datification is part of the solidification of ideas of ability. The more data you produce, the more solid it seems that children are high ability or low ability and so on. And of course, then they form the basis for the practices. So if these children are high ability, of course, they're on that group. And look at my spreadsheet. My spreadsheet says this is the way it works. And the green, crates in green there again are from the research project. I just to illustrate this idea that we have to do grouping because that's what the data says. And if we get told we have to improve our data, then we need to do more grouping. I also discuss some of the use of progress measures, the idea of a kind of flight path as being a particularly kind of way of solidifying actually how children are understood. The relationship with inequality is not quite so researched, but there is some work, and Esther Newman's work is really interesting in kind of discussing how data depoliticizes some of those discussions about things like grouping, because it makes it just seem like that's just a neutral process. We're just putting children into groups, and actually what we're doing is reproducing particular inequalities. The other thing to say is that there is again a kind of very powerful norm within datification, often about who is kind of above or below, just as the same as their idea about a normal brain and normal development. And I think that's a very kind of disciplinary, it's a very disciplinary function within the whole thing. So basically, I get to the point where I say data and ability are very kind of co-reliant as discursive formations. They sort of end up proving each other. So just to sort of finish off, there are kind of obvious tensions in the book between these two things. And I'm not saying that the two things are kind of working together. I'm saying that they're different things and they're working in different ways. There are kind of commonalities, particularly in that they're both sort of part of this progress myth that we can tell ourselves about how much better things are. And now we've got these shiny neuroscience that's giving us new insights into the world, and we can measure everything and it's fantastic. We can track where children are. There's all of that kind of similarity. There's also this norm and the kind of idea of objectivity, which are very important in both of them. And this general sense that we can get authority and legitimacy through numbers and science, and actually then they justify the kind of group differences that we would otherwise be concerned about. Obviously, there are kind of tensions, and one of the ways in which I think we can understand those tensions is that they actually both work towards the same aim, which is to maintain existing power hierarchies. So perhaps it's okay that they don't fit together because they're both working towards the same thing. I talk about who kind of wins in the conclusion in the meritocracy game, and how that obviously makes a white middle class person like me feel uncomfortable, and how difficult that means it is to change, because most of us who benefit from the system and social reproduction, it's quite hard to recognise. And this problem about kind of inherent potential as an idea being a sort of persistent problem within the system. I talk about, as I said, my post-pandemic hopes. I discovered how to make these little symbols on PowerPoint. I was quite excited by those. I discuss how, I hope that the assessment regimes which underpin datification could be reformed, particularly, in fact, we haven't had them for a couple of years, so maybe post-pandemic we could change how we think about testing. I also think about perhaps education being about far more than just about academic knowledge, but also being about welfare. I think the pandemic has shown us that schools have so much more that they do in terms of children and their welfare than perhaps people were aware of. I also talk about that kind of emphasis on collectivity and care and connection, which we saw particularly during the first phases of the pandemic, we could use those connections to try to reduce the sort of fragmented system that we have. And then, of course, above all, my hope is that we could disrupt some of these discourses of ability, the idea that we can measure children, that children are their brains, and that we can label children and give them a number. I'm going to end with just a couple of notes of thanks. First to Policy Press and everyone there for their help with the book and understanding when it was slightly delayed by my third child. Also my kind of previous co-authors who have been very helpful in making me think about some of these ideas, and my colleagues in HHCP and on all the COVID projects who've also kind of really helped me develop some of my ideas. So I'm very grateful to you for all of the ways in which you have inspired this thinking. Thank you.
Alice, thank you so much for that very contemporary take on what you describe as a age-old debate. It reminded me of my reading of The Mismeasure of Man, and also, of course, the self-fulfilling prophecy, etc. So really interesting. Thank you. Can I, before I bring Carol in, can I just encourage the audience to start posting your questions? Now really is the chance, and we have a relatively small window to address them. So Alice, thanks again. And now Carol, do join us for your remarks.
Thank you. Thank you, Alice, for that very useful introduction to your book. I was really pleased when Alice asked me to speak at her book launch, because I'm a strong admirer of her work, which manages to tread what's often a fine line between offering strong messages to policymakers and being theoretically sophisticated. It's research of policy, not research for policy, in Gerald Grace's formulation. So this is a work of policy sociology, this book, driven by a desire to show who wins and who loses in the current system. And I appreciated Alice's autobiographical note there, where she reflects that she's writing the book as a winner in the current system, as most of us are also in the current understandings of who is of high academic ability and what that looks like. So I was particularly interested in Alice's analysis of research on teacher attitudes towards grouping practices. This shows that very few teachers critiqued everyday hegemonic notions of ability as innate, but also as influenced by the home environment. And one quote from the data particularly stood out for me, and that was the explanation by one teacher that pupil premium pupils were one step behind the required target for their age because, quote, our pupil premium children don't do any reading at home, none. This casual utterance demonstrates how a group of children whose shared characteristic is only that their parents have low incomes are lumped together, and their parents are all assumed to not read at home with their children, a lack of bedtime stories being an established way of signalling the bad parent. Of course, we can't put too much analytic weight on any one quote, but it did jump out at me as suggesting that this idea of the good parent still retains considerably discursive power in terms of formulating a child's ability, and is still apparently defined by very narrow confines of good parent behaviour directed towards supporting the school aims, as long been argued by sociological work on homeschool relations. In her book, I found that Alice very effectively brought together and developed different aspects of her work, as she's been saying: datification and other neoliberal school reforms that provide the context for schooling practices; Foucault and CRT to analyse the taken for granted embedded expectations and assumptions made about ability, their history, and how these intersect with intersectional identities to shape practices of classifying children; and neuroscience and the way in which public understandings of findings, public misunderstandings, as well as Alice has been saying, from neuroscience interact with established inequalities and injustices. As Alice says in the book, race is never very far away from discourse about brains. Understandings of neuroscience bring, to quote, a neutrality and pseudoscientific legitimacy to ability. Another piece of data that stood out for me was when a teacher described some children as not being developed enough to hear different sounds. This is seen as a biological stroke developmental skill, not a social cultural one. As Alice says in her comment on the quote, hearing sounds in standard English, nursery rhymes and games like I Spy, again the spectre of the bad parent as someone who never does these things lurks. All these things can help children become familiar with standard sounds in English, but are experiences that are unevenly distributed. Alice notes that the slippage between the biological and the social is unnoticed and dangerous, leading to the reinscription of discourses about the normal. I've also been able to trace the narrow confines of the notions of the academically able through recent work with Caroline Oliver and Georgia Pavlopoulou, looking at autistic students in mainstream schools. Our arguments fitted very well with Alice's arguments. Many of these students didn't fit into school definitions of ideal learners. They might have detailed knowledge and understanding and a strong desire to learn, but on topics that interested them and weren't necessarily part of the curriculum. Or they may have excelled engaging with the learning material, but found being in a classroom environment anxiety-inducing and overwhelming. Measured against a now definition of test results, some of these children were failing. However, it is easy to blame teachers for their narrow understandings, for their actions which result in exclusionary practices. And Alice avoids this in her book by pointing to the way in which teachers are bound by a neoliberal system that centres high-stakes tests, together with the overwhelming importance laid on targets and what is accurately described as a fear of Ofsted. In this case, teachers are often doing without believing, to use Meg Maguire and Annette Braun's phrase. However, as Alice argues, the space for refusal, for resistance, is narrowed still further by the embeddedness of common sense understandings of ability as fixed and innate. Alice takes an optimistic tone at the end of the book, wondering if one result of the disruption caused by the pandemic is the reinscribing of the importance of schools' roles as institutions for the whole child. That focus on children's well-being and seeing them in a more rounded way, not simply as a vessel for information, a learner abstracted from their context, but rather embedded in a family and a community that the school is part of too. As research by Alice and several of her other colleagues showed, many schools played a vital role in welfare support for families during the first 2020 lockdown. And many schools are now trying to focus not on test results, but on responding to student need. However, I now feel somewhat less optimistic about the opportunity to rethink and reset, suspecting that in fact what we may be seeing is a quick return to normal. For example, the government has given Ofsted an extra £24 million funding for an accelerated inspections schedule to inspect all schools by the summer of 2025, against the hopes of those teachers that Alice just identified. However, as Alice points out in her book, the inspection framework was tentatively beginning to move away from an all-out focus on test results pre-pandemic, and it is possible that this may still continue. Still, the new Education Secretary, Nadeem Zahawi, although initially signalling a more collaborative approach between his department and schools than was the case under his predecessor, Gavin Williams, although it may not have been possible to be less collaborative, is also planning a new white paper in the new year, which he said will tackle illiteracy and innumeracy, an example of policymakers constructing a particular policy problem and then identifying the solution, their desired solution, which in this case, I suspect, is likely to involve an even greater focus on testing. I think a key focus for us as sociologists of education is to map and analyse school responses as we move, hopefully, out of the pandemic, especially in those few schools that are trying to do things differently. And I'm glad that Alice is going to be one of those sociologists of education, because we need nuanced, theoretically informed and insightful understandings of and responses to policy. And Alice is well placed to provide those. Thank you.
Carol, thanks very much indeed. We've got questions coming in. And so without further ado, I'm going to choose one of those to begin with. A classic question for academics, and it's from Paula Moses, who says, how would you define disadvantage?
It's a very tricky one. There is some discussion, obviously, about how on earth you define these things. There is a kind of government definition, which is used particularly in early years to justify who gets free places and so on, which is about what benefits you receive. It's a really problematic term. I think we don't really have a term which doesn't come with all of those notions of kind of deficit. There isn't a neutral way of talking really about kind of the differences grouped. And obviously free school meals is a really inadequate way of measuring it. I suppose that recently, I think, particularly with all the COVID work I've been doing, I've started to try to talk far more about children in poverty, which is obviously not the same group, but to try to actually focus ourselves back on the kind of material impact and children who are really being affected by poverty, rather than to think about disadvantage, I suppose, which is in the end become a term which means a lot of things to a lot of people. So that isn't an answer, I know, but I'm saying it's a very difficult thing to define.
Thanks, Alice. Yeah. A comment and a query from Gemma Moss. Robert Halfon and Steve Chalk were talking about the role of schools within communities on Radio 4 this morning. I personally think something has shifted in the conversation around education right now. I'd like to ask Alice what she thinks the role of the researcher is here in exploiting gaps and supporting teachers and communities in arguing for something more. Exclamation mark.
Oh, Gemma, it's always good to have a question from you. I think, I suppose I feel a little less optimistic probably than when I wrote this book about how much things were going to change. That said, I think we've shown that there is a place for research. There's a place for recording and acknowledging and amplifying the voices of teachers and those within the system, and attempting to get that information out there to policymakers, even if they're not listening in very obvious ways. I think there is still a possibility about shifting the terms of the conversation. And I do think there is a real role for education research in, both in the short term and in the longer term, attempting to shift the dial, as they say. And I think it would, we have to think that, because why are we going to carry on otherwise? But we have to think it's going to make a difference. And I think it does. And I think we have to remember that we do have power and influence, and we should use that particularly to allow the voices of people who aren't being heard within the system to be heard more loudly.
Thanks. Another question now, this time from Olga Kara, who says, is there a place for data and neuroscience in your ideal education system? And if so, what would it look like?
Oh, thank you, Olga. That's a really good question. I mean, data has always existed in schools. It's not like teachers have never written down numbers. It's far more about kind of how it's being used and how the sort of dominance of data. So I suppose the role of data, I would say, be to be useful to the teacher, to be helpful in helping them to teach better, rather than to be about labeling and grouping and deciding who does what or who is labeled as above or below. So I suppose that data that is helpful is the place, I would say, is the place for data, to kind of put it simply, helpful to the teacher and to the child. In terms of neuroscience, I actually have real doubts about whether it can be used at all. I mean, based on my understanding of what we know about the brain from neuroscience, is that we don't really definitely know a great deal that is helpful as yet. And because it's a very sort of young field and everyone is still arguing about what things mean, trying to kind of put any of those things into practice is really tricky, because we can't sort of make them into kind of real recommendations when there's still a huge amount of debate about kind of what we know about the brain and so on. So I'm kind of pretty cautious about any sort of use of neuroscience, I think, in education, I would say.
This one I would roughly characterize as about the parent from hell, but maybe I'm glossing this unfairly. Annie Campbell says, how do you negotiate your position as a parent in the context of what you know about the system? Do you challenge it at the personal level, or, for example, step back and out of that role into a neutral parent role?
That's also a good question. Thank you, Tammy. I think it is really hard, because what do I do? And I do sort of, there are some asides in the book about the kind of difficulty of trying to kind of be a parent at the same time as critically analysing all of this stuff, because I do sit there and see my children who, you know, have a lot more advantage than I had as a child, and they are being, you know, understood as a, you know, high ability before they even walk in the school, and it makes you very uncomfortable. But then I also kind of want my children to be okay and to do well. So, you know, there's a lot of tension there. And I don't pretend that I've kind of resolved any of it. I suppose I am really aware. I mean, I think of the kind of signs of good parenting, you know, that Carol was talking about. I know it matters whether I sign the reading books, because I know what that teacher's going to read into it, whether I've kind of remembered everything that they need. So perhaps it makes me more kind of concerned to kind of fit into that mold sometimes, which isn't a very necessarily a very good thing. It is. I think it is really tricky. I think I mentioned in the book about how even when I was pregnant with my third one, which is when I started writing the book, there were all these posters in the antenatal room sort of talking about building your baby's brain before they're even born, and how you've got to talk to your baby in the womb and all this sort of thing. And I suppose it makes me a bit more kind of, I suppose I'm just sort of attuned to it all, aren't I? I notice all these things, whereas perhaps other parents are just kind of taking it all in and not really noticing so much of it. But I don't know really how I resolve that tension. I don't think I can be neutral. I can't kind of step back and just say, no, when I'm a parent, I'm not thinking about any of this stuff, because it's all there and I'm noticing it. So I think I have to kind of try to kind of notice and perhaps disrupt where I can, but I'm a bit pessimistic about the potential for disruption, really.
Thanks, Alice. Finally, within the minute or so we have left, Joe Holgarten from the Centre for Education and Youth says, does your book address and or challenge some of the recent research and meta-analyses on genes / DNA and educational outcomes, for instance, Robert Plomin's recent book, Blueprint?
Yeah, I do talk about, not about that book particularly, though Plomin does get a mention, because there is a whole discussion about the kind of resurgence of the new eugenics, and basically all the stuff about how the new gene science is bring back a lot of those ideas about sort of inevitable differences between different groups and how dangerous that is. They're a bit less obvious than they were in the past, perhaps, you know, with the bell curve and things, but there is still a kind of really dangerous, insidious reinscription of some of those old notions about deficit within a lot of that discussion about genes and DNA. So yes, in part.
Brilliant. Alice, congratulations. Thank you very much. Carol, thanks also to you for your wisdom and insights. Thanks to Will and the team very much for helping us organise this today. I share Alice's feeling that we will look forward to doing things like this in person with whatever glass of wine or tea or juice we can get. But most of all, thanks to everyone who's attended today. We look forward to sort of working with you on these kind of issues as we go on. So have a good day. Thanks all of you, and goodbye.